On the night of 26th May 1940, in a cramped tunnel cut through the chalk beneath Dover Castle, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay sat at a table covered with maps of the English Channel and began to plan what would either save or end British participation in the Second World War. Above him, the medieval towers of one of England's oldest and most important fortresses rose against the night sky. Across the Channel, 26 miles away, more than 300,000 soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force and their French allies were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk as German forces closed in around them. Ramsay had 9 days. He had 3 evacuation routes across the Channel, designated X, Y, and Z on his maps. He had ships, warships and merchant vessels, destroyers and minesweepers, fishing boats and pleasure cruisers, and the improvised flotilla that history would call the Little Ships. He had the tunnel, the telephone exchange, the operations room carved from the white chalk of Castle Hill. He had the same strategic position that every commander of Dover Castle had occupied for 2,000 years, the narrowest point of the English Channel, 21 miles from the coast of France, the gateway through which all movement between the island and the continent had to pass. He evacuated 338,226 men. He saved the British Army. The operation was called Dynamo. The tunnels from which it was directed are still there, still accessible to visitors, still carrying the marks of the 1940 emergency that made them one of the most important military command centers in British history. Dover Castle has been in continuous occupation for over 2,000 years, making it the most continuously occupied strategic site in Britain. It contains the tallest Roman building in Britain, a lighthouse built in the 1st century AD, still standing inside the medieval walls. It nearly fell to a French invasion in 1216, when England came within days of having a French king. It was built in its current form by a monarch consumed by guilt over a murder he had as good as ordered. It was the command center for the evacuation that prevented Britain from being knocked out of the Second World War in its first year. And it was equipped, in the 1960s, to serve as a regional seat of government in the event of nuclear war. The impressive English fortress, guardian of the Channel, is not the myth. It is all of those things. What is missing from the picture is the detail, the specific, documented, astonishing sequence of events that make Dover Castle not merely impressive, but genuinely extraordinary across every century it has existed. This is that detail. Chapter 1. The Heights and Their Earliest Peoples, Before the Castle, 500 BC to AD 43. The white cliffs of Dover are the first thing most people arriving in England from France see. From the sea, they are overwhelming. Vertical chalk faces rising up to 107 meters above the waterline. A natural wall that announced to every arriving army, every arriving merchant, every arriving pilgrim that they had reached a different country. Julius Caesar, on his first reconnaissance of Britain in 55 BC, was reportedly dissuaded from landing at Dover, specifically because the heights above the beach would have given defending Britons a fatal advantage over his troops attempting to disembark from boats. The vintage news account records, Caesar had been dissuaded from landing at Dover for fear of the British throwing javelins at his troops from the heights. The Castle Hill, the promontory now called Castle Hill or Eastern Heights, is the highest point of the Dover Cliffs at this location. The chalk rock is white and friable at the surface, but deeper down it becomes harder and more workable, which is why tunnels through it have been feasible since the late 18th century. The view from the top of Castle Hill is one of the most consequential in Britain. On a clear day, you can see the coast of France. On most days, you can see that there is a coast there. The distance is 21 miles at the Strait of Dover's narrowest point. This is the shortest sea crossing between Britain and the continent, and it has been the main crossing point for the movement of people, armies, goods, and ideas for as long as anyone has been crossing. The Grokopedia account of Dover Castle identifies possible Iron Age origins for the site, and the Histories and Castles account confirms, long before medieval kings laid stone upon stone, Iron Age, Communities recognized the defensive potential of the site. Archaeological evidence suggests that hill forts occupied the cliffs more than 2,000 years ago. The Iron Age hill fort on Castle Hill was part of the same tradition of defensive hilltop settlement that characterized pre-Roman Britain across the region. The heights were fortified before the Romans arrived because the heights were obviously the correct place to fortify. They commanded the harbor, the beach, and the most traveled sea lane in the northern world. The community that occupied the heights in the Iron Age period was the first of an unbroken sequence of occupants that continues to the present day. English heritage describes Dover Castle as having been in continuous occupation for over 2,000 years, a claim that, if taken to include the Iron Age hilltop settlement rather than just the Roman period, extends significantly further. The specific identities and political organization of the Iron Age inhabitants of Castle Hill are not recoverable from the available evidence. What is recoverable is the physical fact that they were there, that they understood the strategic value of the position, and that they established a tradition of fortification on this specific piece of chalk that every subsequent power would continue. The fundamental strategic logic has never changed. To control the height above Dover Harbor is to control the crossing. To control the crossing is to control the movement of armies, goods, and communications between England and France. This is why Dover Castle has been fought over, maintained, expanded, and invested in by every governing power that has held this part of England for the past 2 millennia. The Iron Age people who built a hill fort here were not wrong about the site's value. They were simply the first to recognize something that everyone who came after them recognized equally. Dover's other physical characteristic, the white chalk of the cliffs, is as important to its history as the height. Chalk is unusual building and engineering material, relatively soft and easy to cut when fresh, but hardening with exposure to air. The Roman Pharos was built partly of tufa and green sandstone, materials brought to the site because they were more durable than raw chalk. The medieval castle was built of limestone brought from Caen and Kentish ragstone, but the chalk itself, the bedrock of Castle Hill, was the medium through which Dover's most secret history was written. The Napoleonic barracks, the Second World War operations rooms, the Cold War government bunker, all were cut from the chalk. The rock that made Dover's cliffs famous was also what made its underground city possible. Chapter 2. The Romans and their lighthouse, Dubrus and the Pharaohs, 43 A.D. to A.D. 450. In 43 A.D., the Emperor Claudius sent a Roman army to conquer Britain. The invasion force crossed the Channel and landed on the Kentish coast, not at Dover itself. The harbor was then a river estuary, the Dower, before it was substantially modified, but nearby, at Richborough to the north. Within a generation, Dover, Dubrus to the Romans, had become the primary channel crossing point and the headquarters of the Classis Britannica, the Roman fleet in Britain. The strategic logic that the Romans applied to Dover was identical to that of the Iron Age inhabitants before them and the Norman castle builders after them. The narrowest crossing point required control and management. The Classis Britannica was the instrument of that control, a fleet of warships and transport vessels that maintained Roman communications across the Channel, protected the crossing against pirates and raiders, and projected Roman naval power into the North Sea and beyond. To support the fleet, the Romans built on Castle Hill. The first substantial Roman fort at Dover was established in the 70s A.D., and the entire installation was completed by around 130 A.D., with the associated Pharos, the lighthouse, constructed at approximately the same time. The history hit account of the lighthouse gives the precise chronology, dating from around 46 to 50 A.D., during the reign of the Emperor Claudius, and just after the invasion of Britain in 43 A.D. Other sources, including the Grokopedia account, give the date as around A.D. 130. The discrepancy may reflect different construction phases. the earliest beacon installation, and the later substantial stone tower structure. What survives is one of the most remarkable Roman buildings in Britain. The Pharos is an octagonal tower, originally approximately 24 meters tall, across 5 or 6 stories, of which the Roman fabric survives to a height of 12.5 meters. The Roman Arts and Culture account gives the architectural detail: a rubble construction, faced with green sandstone and tufa, featuring double courses of bricks every 7 courses and bonded with hard pink mortar. The tower is the tallest surviving Roman structure in Britain. It is one of only 3 Roman lighthouses to survive anywhere in the former Roman Empire. The Pharos on Castle Hill was not operating alone. A second lighthouse was built on the western heights, the hills on the other side of Dover Harbor, so that ships approaching from France could triangulate their position by reference to both lights. The Google Arts and Culture account of the Pharos notes the deliberate geometry. The views from the topmost stage of the Pharos seem to have been deliberately angled so that it could communicate not only with the second lighthouse on Western Heights, but with Cap Gris-Nez on the French coast. Platforms at the top held burning braziers. A beacon fire visible from France was visible from the English coast. Navigation of the most crossed sea passage in the world was organized by fire. The Roman fort at Dubris went through at least 2 phases. The English Heritage History notes, the fort at Dubris was demolished around AD 215 and a new one constructed around AD 270, which may have continued in use, along with the lighthouses, into the 5th century. The longevity of the Roman military installation at Dover, potentially from the 70s AD to the early 5th century, a period of 3.5 centuries, establishes it as one of the longest continuously occupied military sites in British history. The Classis Britannica, the Roman fleet in Britain, was one of the most significant military organizations in the Roman provincial system. At its peak, it maintained a fleet of warships, galleys, and transport vessels capable of projecting Roman naval power across the North Sea and around the British coast. The fleet's headquarters at Dubris gave it a home port at the most convenient crossing point between Britain and Gaul, and the 2 lighthouses that flanked the harbor entrance, the Pharos on Castle Hill and the second tower on the Western Heights, were the infrastructure that made that port usable in all but the most extreme weather. The material culture of the Classis Britannica is well documented by its distinctive stamped tiles found at Dover and at other sites across the Roman province. The fleet's workshops produced building materials with the CLBR stamp, Classis Britannica, that identify their origin as clearly as a modern manufacturer's trademark. Thousands of these tiles have been found in the buildings of Roman Dover and at other sites associated with the fleet. The Roman fort at Dubris housed not just the fleet's administrative headquarters, but also the workshops, warehouses, and domestic buildings of a substantial military-commercial complex. Archaeologists have identified hypocosted buildings, the heated floor systems that allowed comfortable living in the damp channel climate, suggesting that officers of some social standing were resident at the fort. The Dover harbor was not merely a military installation, it was a working port through which the trade and communications of the entire Roman province passed. When Roman imperial authority in Britain collapsed in the early 5th century, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a gradual withdrawal of administrative and military capacity, the fort at Dubris was abandoned. The Pharos continued to stand, too massive to easily demolish, its function as a navigational beacon presumably still useful to the post-Roman communities around Dover Harbor, even without the institutional organization that had originally built it. The Saxon Church of St. Mary in Castro was built around 1000 AD within what had been the Roman enclosure, and the Pharos was incorporated into it as a bell tower, one of the more practical instances of Roman infrastructure finding a medieval reuse. The Journal of Antiquities account notes the tower's subsequent history. When the Church of St. Mary in Castro was built, in about AD 1000, the Dubris Pharos was incorporated into the design as the church's bell tower. Chapter 3. Saxons, the Church, and the Edo. Norman seizure, AD 450 to 1180. The period between the end of Roman administration and the Norman conquest of 1066 is the most poorly documented in Dover Castle's history, but not the least significant. The Saxon community that established itself around the old Roman installations on Castle Hill created the institutional continuity that the Normans would inherit. The Church of St. Mary in Castro, built around 1000 AD, is evidence of a substantial and presumably prosperous Saxon community. The English heritage account notes that its exceptional size hints that it might have had a royal patron. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, reigned 1020 to 53, father of King Harold, reigned 1066, is one possibility. Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, was the son of one of the most powerful men in England. His father Godwin's possible patronage of the St. Mary in Castro Church would make Dover Hill a site of family significance for the most important Anglo-Saxon dynasty of the 11th century. When Harold, as king, prepared England's defences against the twin threats of Harold Hardrada of Norway in the north and William of Normandy in the south, the Channel crossing point at Dover was among the positions he needed to secure. He did not secure it in time. The Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, destroyed the English army and killed Harold. William of Normandy took the throne of England. Among his first actions was the seizure of Dover. William arrived at Dover shortly after Hastings and found the Saxon burh, the fortified settlement, on the heights. The Grokopedia account records, the Normans established a castle there shortly after the conquest. The English heritage history confirms he established a fortification, possibly around the church, but there are no surviving remains. William's fortification of Dover was immediate and deliberate. The same crossing point logic that had operated since the Iron Age applied to the Norman conquest as powerfully as to any earlier episode. Dover controlled the route between Normandy and England. William controlled Normandy and England. Dover had to be in Norman hands. The Saxon period at Dover was not merely a passive interval between Roman occupation and Norman construction. The Church of St. Mary in Castro, which Harold Godwinson's father may have patronized, was a substantial ecclesiastical building. The exceptional size that English heritage notes is evidence of genuine ambition and investment. The community that maintained this church and the Pharaoh's bell tower beside it was living and working on a site that had been continuously occupied for at least 1,000 years before they arrived. The accumulated physical infrastructure of Roman fort, lighthouse, and whatever remained of earlier structures would have been visible to them as they went about their daily lives on Castle Hill. The Domesday Book of 1086, the great survey of England that William commissioned 20 years after the conquest, records Dover as a significant place with complex obligations to the crown. The town owed the king 20 ships for 15 days a year, each with a crew of 21 men, in exchange for certain exemptions from royal service. This arrangement, which placed Dover's maritime capacity at the crown's disposal, was the medieval formulation of the same relationship that had made Dover strategically central since the Iron Age. The Saxon and early Norman period at Dover is obscured by the comprehensive rebuilding of the 1180s that would create the castle as it essentially exists today. The physical record of what came before Henry II's great building campaign has been largely obliterated by it. What survived, and what still stands, is the Roman Pharos, incorporated into the Saxon church, sitting inside the medieval castle walls, a layering of civilizations in a single structure that has no parallel in England. Chapter 4. Henry II, Becket, and the Palace of Pilgrims, 1170 to 1190. On December 29, 1170, in the cathedral at Canterbury, 4 knights acting on the furious and possibly unguarded words of King Henry II murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. The murder sent shockwaves through the Christian world. The Pope threatened to excommunicate Henry. The king himself was widely understood to have ordered, or at least provoked, the killing. In 1173, Becket was canonized. In 1174, Henry walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury to Becket's shrine and submitted himself to floggings from the monks as public penance. And 10 years later, Henry II built Dover Castle. The connection between the murder and the building is not accidental. It is, according to the most careful scholarly analysis of the castle's history, the actual causal explanation for why Henry spent what he spent on Dover. The English heritage account of the connection is precise. Between 1180 and 1189, Henry spent over £6,000 on the construction of Dover Castle, making it the most expensive castle project of his reign in England. That figure, over £6,000 in 12th century money, represented, according to the academia.edu scholarly analysis, approximately 2/3 of total English castle expenditure in that period. The Monumental History Substack account puts the spending in context. That might not sound like much, but depending on how you calculate the valuation of England's 12th century currency, that's at least tens of millions of pounds today, and likely much more. It represented nearly a quarter of Henry's annual recorded income. Why did the murder of Becket lead to the building of Dover Castle? The chain of causation runs through a French king's visit. Louis VII of France in 1179 made a pilgrimage to Canterbury to pray at Becket's shrine, the first time a French king had ever come to England as a pilgrim. It was a diplomatic and political event of the first importance. Louis was acknowledging the sanctity of a man whose murder had been the responsibility of the English king. Pilgrims from across Europe were flocking to Canterbury. They were arriving through Dover, and Henry, when Louis came, had no suitable accommodation for a king of Louis's stature anywhere between Dover and Canterbury. The Monumental History account records the embarrassment directly. In rural Kent, Henry didn't have any posh cross-channel lodgings for a king of Louis's stature, and that was, well, embarrassing. The English heritage account frames it with scholarly precision. Henry would need a magnificent setting in which to welcome important visitors seeking to take the journey to Becket's shrine. Dover Castle was the answer. Henry commissioned his engineer Maurice to build the most advanced castle in the Latin West, not primarily as a military fortification, but as a palatial reception complex for the dignified reception of the European royalty and nobility who were now arriving at Dover on their way to Becket's shrine. The Great Tower, the keep, which still dominates the castle and which English heritage describes as a sophisticated building that combined defense with a palatial residence, was the centerpiece of this vision. It was built to impress visiting kings, not to repel attacking armies. The Great Tower is built to a carefully planned layout of considerable sophistication. 2 floors of residential apartments, each with its own great hall, chamber, and ancillary spaces, were stacked on top of a basement and a service floor. The upper Great Hall, where Henry would have received his most important guests, was reached by an external forebuilding, a deliberate processional route designed to build expectation and demonstrate architectural ambition before the visitor even entered the main space. The wells sunk through the building provided water supply independent of siege conditions. The overall design reflects an architect of considerable skill working to a brief that combined palatial display with military defensibility. Maurice's design created the inner bailey and towers, part of the outer bailey, and the Great Tower at the center. The English heritage account of the castle visible today, the most advanced castle design in Europe when it was built. He spent what he spent on Dover because Becket's murder had, accidentally, made Canterbury the most important pilgrimage site in northern Europe, made Dover the primary entry port for European pilgrims and royalty, and made a suitably magnificent reception facility at Dover a matter of royal prestige rather than merely royal convenience. The murder, the penance, the saint, the pilgrims, the French king's visit, the English king's embarrassment, These were the specific contingencies that produced one of the finest examples of medieval castle architecture in the world. English heritage, with appropriate irony, concludes, "History is an accumulation of chances. If Becket and Henry had not fallen out, if Becket had not been murdered, the great tower would probably never have been built." Chapter 5. The Key to England, the 1216 Siege and the Near Conquest of England, 1199 to 1220. Henry II's great building campaign produced a castle. What that castle prevented, in 1216, 27 years after Henry's death, was nothing less than the permanent conquest of England by France. The crisis had its roots in Henry's own family. His youngest son, John, was one of the most catastrophically ineffective rulers in English history. John lost Normandy to Philip II of France in 1204. He attempted to recover it in expensive campaigns funded by taxation that his barons increasingly refused to bear. In 1215, the barons forced him to sign Magna Carta, the great charter that limited royal power and established the principle that even kings were subject to law. John immediately repudiated it and appealed to the Pope, who declared Magna Carta void. The barons' response was to invite the French to invade. Prince Louis of France, son of Philip II, the man who had taken Normandy from John, was offered the English throne by the rebel barons. He sailed for England in May 1216 with a large army. The De Rais military account of the siege records what happened when Louis arrived. When Louis landed in England on the 21st of May, 1216, John fled before him. Canterbury opened its gates to his army. Rochester Castle fell after a short siege, and the French prince entered London in triumph on the 2nd of June. By summer, Louis had London and Winchester. Most of England, it seemed, was going to become part of France. The one obstacle was Dover. Dover's constable was Hubert de Burgh, Justiciar of England, John's principal minister, a veteran commander who had previously led the heroic defense of Chinon Castle in France. He described Dover Castle, in a phrase that has become one of the best-known formulations in English military history, as the key to England. The De Rais military account of his forces, more than 140 knights, and many more soldiers. Against this force, Louis brought his entire army and the full apparatus of 13th-century siege warfare. The first siege began in the summer of 1216. Louis concentrated his assault on the northern gateway, the main entrance to the castle, which faced the town and was the obvious point of attack. The English heritage account of the siege describes the medieval technologies deployed: attempted bribery, siege engines, mining. The French miners dug beneath the foundations of the barbican, the outer defensive structure in front of the main gate, and brought it down. The eastern gate tower fell. French forces got into the outer bailey, but they could not get further. The marked by teachers' account records what happened at the critical moment. There was fierce fighting inside the inner bailey, but the loyal garrison and constable of the castle defended it effectively, driving the French out and barricading the breach of the wall. The garrison built a wooden barricade across the breach. The French assault was stopped. King John died on October 18, 1216, in the middle of the siege. This was a political crisis for both sides. John was the man the barons had rebelled against, and with him gone, the justification for inviting Louis to invade was substantially weakened. Louis urged the Dover garrison to surrender. They were holding the castle for a dead king, after all. Hubert de Burgh refused. He was now holding it for John's 9-year-old son, Henry III. The English heritage account of the siege's political resolution. With John out of the way, the barons installed 9-year-old Henry III on the throne, and Louis's losing battle concluded in a naval defeat off the coastal town of Sandwich by the resourceful de Burgh. The Battle of Sandwich in August 1217 was a sea engagement in which Hubert de Burgh, who had been commanding the land defense of Dover, switched to commanding a naval force and intercepted Louis's supply convoy. Louis's reinforcements were destroyed. he was forced back to the negotiating table, formally renounced his claim to the English throne, and returned to France. The consequences of Dover's resistance are not simply military. If Dover had fallen, Louis would have controlled both London and the Channel crossing. His position as the effectively recognized King of England would have been vastly stronger, and the infant Henry III would have had nowhere to operate from. The de Rey military account of the castle's significance is precise. Dover Castle was a vital strategic and communication linchpin. In 1216, it was the pivot on which the entire question of whether England would be governed by an English dynasty or a French one turned. The evidence of the siege is still physically present in the castle. The Magna Carta Trust account notes, "Evidence of mining tunnels can still be seen." After the siege, the northern gate that Louis had partially destroyed was permanently blocked, and the castle's entrance was moved to a new defensive arrangement that put it further from any potential attacker's natural approach. The castle that visitors enter today still reflects the modifications that Hubert de Burgh made after 1217, when the lessons of the French assault were translated into permanent defensive improvements. Chapter 6. The Medieval Fortress, Constables, Kings, and Strategic Command, 1220 to 1485. The century and a half after the 1216 to 17 sieges was the period in which Dover Castle reached its full medieval development. The concentric fortification, the elaborate gatehouse complex, the underground passages, the comprehensive defensive circuit that made it one of the most formidable castles in Europe. The work that Hubert de Burgh began after the siege, blocking the northern gate, creating new entrance arrangements, strengthening the outer curtain wall, was continued by successive constables and royal masters throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. Henry III, who owed his throne in some measure to Dover Castle's resistance, was an enthusiastic and expensive builder of English castles. He spent substantially on Dover's defenses, adding the Constable's Gate, the elaborate new western entrance that replaced the blocked northern gate as the main way into the castle. The Constable's Gate is still the principal entrance today, a massive twin-towered gatehouse of considerable architectural sophistication, designed both for defense and for the controlled, impressive reception of visitors. It reflects the dual character of Dover Castle throughout its medieval history, a military installation that was simultaneously a symbol of royal authority and a reception facility for the movements of kings and their courts. The castle's role in Anglo-French affairs continued to be central through the 13th and 14th centuries. The Hundred Years' War, the intermittent conflict between England and France that began in 1337 and lasted until 1453, made Dover's strategic position more important than ever. English armies crossed from Dover to France. French prisoners were held at Dover. Communications between the English court and its forces in France ran through the castle's administrative apparatus. The Constable of Dover was one of the most important military appointments in England, and the Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, the official responsible for the coastal defense of southeast England, often held the office simultaneously. The castle held distinguished prisoners throughout the medieval period. The pattern that had begun with the French involvement of 1216 continued. Dover was the obvious place to hold high-status captives taken in the Anglo-French conflict, because it was the most secure castle in England and because it provided the easiest means of transfer to France when ransom terms were eventually agreed. The underground passages that had been begun as part of the post-1216 defensive works were extended through the medieval period, creating the complex of tunnels under Castle Hill that would eventually play their most significant role in 1940. The castle also continued to function as a royal residence and reception facility. The English monarchs who fought the 100 Years' War, Edward III, the Black Prince, Henry V, all used Dover regularly as they moved between England and their French territories. The great tower that Henry II had built as a palatial reception facility for pilgrims to Becket's shrine remained in use as a royal residence, its apartments maintained and furnished for royal occupation. When Henry V prepared his 1415 campaign that would end at Agincourt, Dover was one of the embarkation points for his army. After Agincourt and the subsequent Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which made Henry V heir to the French throne, the Channel crossing to France was briefly an internal communication within what appeared to be a single Anglo-French monarchy. That prospect died with Henry V in 1422 and was finally extinguished when English forces were expelled from France by 1453. Dover reverted to its permanent role, the crossing point between two separate kingdoms. The physical development of Dover Castle during the medieval period was driven by the specific lessons of the 1216 to 17 sieges and by the ongoing evolution of military technology. The post-siege work under Hubert de Burgh and his successors added the underground passages that connected different parts of the castle, the earliest phase of what would eventually become the extensive tunnel network of the 20th century. The Constable's Gate, built as the new main entrance after the northern gate was permanently blocked, is one of the most architecturally impressive medieval gatehouses in England, a twin-towered structure of considerable defensive and aesthetic sophistication that remains the principal entrance to the castle today. The Constable of Dover Castle held one of the most important military commands in England. The office was sometimes combined with that of Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, the official responsible for the defense of southeast England through the system of 5 ancient ports: Dover, Sandwich, Hastings, New Romney, and Hythe, later expanded to include Rye and Winchelsea. The Lord Warden's responsibility was to provide ships for the King's service and to maintain the naval defenses of the Channel crossing. It was a genuinely powerful office in the medieval period, and its combination with the constableship of Dover Castle made the holder of both positions the most powerful individual in the entire southeast of England. The castle also served as a diplomatic stage throughout the medieval period. The English kings who fought in France needed a suitable venue to receive French ambassadors, negotiate truces, and manage the endless diplomatic traffic that accompanied the 100 Years' War. Dover Castle, positioned at the crossing point where French and English interests met most directly, was the natural location for many of these negotiations. The great tower that Henry II had built for the reception of European royalty. Chapter 7. Artillery, Tudor Lords, and the Reformation. Crossing, 1485 to 1600. The Tudor period transformed Dover Castle's function in ways that reflected both the military revolution of the 16th century and the peculiar political situation of the Henrician Reformation. The same revolution in artillery technology that had ended Bamburgh Castle's medieval military life in 1464 required Dover's fortifications to be adapted, extended, and supplemented with earthworks and gun platforms capable of mounting the heavy cannon that now defined strategic defense. Henry VIII, the most dramatically self-assertive of the Tudor monarchs, and the man whose break with Rome created the Protestant Church of England, invested substantially in Dover's defenses. The Reformation had made England's relationship with the Catholic powers of Europe, France and Spain in particular, fundamentally hostile, and the vulnerability of the Channel crossing was more acute than ever. Henry's response was to build a chain of coastal artillery forts along the southeast coast, of which Deal, Walmer, and Sandown castles, all in Kent, were the most important. Dover itself received new artillery bastions and defensive earthworks. Henry VIII crossed from Dover on his way to the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, the spectacular diplomatic meeting with Francis I of France near Calais that was, in its theatrical and financial ambition, one of the defining performances of Tudor kingship. The meeting was a statement of wealth, confidence, and mutual recognition between the two monarchies, and it was organized and serviced through Dover's logistical capacity. The castle's role as the primary management point for cross-channel royal diplomacy was continuous from Henry II to the present day. Mary I, the Catholic daughter of Henry VIII, whose brief reign, 1553 to 1558, reversed her father's Reformation and restored England briefly to Rome, used Dover in a grimmer context. The embarkation point for the forces she sent to support her husband Philip II of Spain in the war against France that ended with the loss of Calais in 1558. Calais, England's last possession in France, held since 1347, was taken by the Duke of Guise in January 1558. Mary's famous reaction that Calais would be found written on her heart reflected the loss of the last French territory that the Dover crossing had for 2 centuries been the gateway to. After 1558, Dover's strategic calculus was permanently altered. England's continental possessions were gone, and the castle was now purely defensive rather than the gateway to an English empire in France. Elizabeth I, who succeeded Mary in 1558 and reigned until 1603, faced repeated threats of invasion from Catholic Spain that made Dover's Channel crossing role more vital than ever. The Spanish Armada of 1588, the great fleet that Philip II launched against England, sailed up the Channel past Dover, and the English fleet that pursued it had Dover as its principal base. The castle's cliff-top position gave observers a direct view of the Armada's passage. The beacons lit along the English coast to warn of the Armada's approach were part of the same signaling tradition as the Roman pharaohs that still stood on Castle Hill, fire on heights communicating danger across distances. After Gravelines, where English fire ships broke the Spanish formation and the wind drove the Armada north around Scotland, the threat of invasion receded for a generation. But Dover's strategic significance did not diminish with the Spanish threat. The castle continued to serve as the crossing point for English military operations on the continent, the Low Countries campaigns against Spanish power that Elizabeth supported, the intelligence operations that ran through the Channel ports, the management of the Protestant alliance that was the backbone of English foreign policy. The Tudor period also saw the beginning of a transformation in the castle's domestic character. The great tower that Henry II had built as a royal palace was increasingly used for administrative purposes rather than royal residence. The English monarchs of the Tudor period, when they used Dover, tended to prefer the town's more comfortable accommodations to the medieval keep. The castle became more purely a military and administrative installation, and less a royal residence, a transition that would accelerate in subsequent centuries. Henry VIII's development of the coastal artillery, forts at Deal, Walmer, and Sandgate, more modern structures better suited to the new artillery age than the medieval castle, did not make Dover redundant, but it did change its role in the defensive system. Dover remained the command position and the symbolic heart of the southeast defenses. The new artillery forts were the forward edge of the actual defensive line. The relationship between Dover's administrative function and the operational military function of the forward positions would persist in different forms through every subsequent era of the castle's history. Chapter 8. Civil War, Decline, and the Strategic Crossing, 1600 to 1793. The 17th and 18th centuries were, by Dover Castle's standards, relatively quiet, which is to say that England's most strategically important fortress did not serve as the pivot of any world historical event in this period, but continued to serve as the administrative center for the management of the Channel crossing, the seat of the Constable of Dover Castle and Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, and the command position for the coastal defenses of southeast England. The English Civil War of 1642 to 1651 touched Dover Castle significantly. The castle was held for Parliament against the Royalists, its strategic position making its allegiance critical to the control of the Channel crossing. Parliamentary forces held Dover throughout the conflict, preventing Royalist communications with France from running through the easiest and most direct channel. The Royalist cause was repeatedly hampered by the difficulty of maintaining communications with the continent through alternative routes. Dover's parliamentary loyalty was not incidental to the war's outcome. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 brought a new political reality to Dover's management. Charles had been in French exile during the Civil War years, and his return to England from France through Dover in May 1660 was a moment of considerable ceremony, the king returning from the continent through the castle that had been waiting for him. The Treaty of Dover in 1670, the secret agreement between Charles II and Louis XIV of France, in which Charles agreed to convert to Catholicism and support France's wars in exchange for French subsidies, was negotiated at Dover Castle. The treaty's secrecy was such that only a handful of ministers knew its Catholic provisions. The rest of the English government believed they were negotiating only a commercial arrangement. Dover Castle, the site of so many significant Anglo-French negotiations across the centuries, hosted one of the most consequential and controversial secret agreements in British diplomatic history. The 18th century saw the castle's purely military functions diminish, while its ceremonial and administrative roles continued. The Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, a position that had originally been a serious military command, responsible for the naval defense of southeast England, had by the 18th century evolved into an honorary appointment held by significant political figures and used as a mark of status and income. The castle itself was increasingly maintained rather than developed. The medieval structures were repaired, the Tudor artillery platforms were updated, but no major new construction occurred. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, each brought renewed anxiety about the Channel crossing and the vulnerability of the southeast to French attack. Dover's defenses were inspected, assessed, and in some cases modified, but without the comprehensive reconstruction that new military realities demanded. The castle was aging, its medieval walls increasingly inadequate against the artillery that the 18th century could deploy, but the resources required to rebuild it on modern principles were not forthcoming until the French Revolution changed everything. William Pitt the Elder, who served as Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports from 1708 to 1713, and later William Pitt the Younger, who held the office from 1792 until his death in 1806, both used the position's Dover connections during periods of acute strategic anxiety about the Channel. The younger Pitt, as Prime Minister during the French Revolutionary Wars, was deeply involved in the planning of Dover's defenses against the threat of invasion that Napoleon was preparing. The tunnels that would be dug in 1797 to 1802 were a direct consequence of the plans made under Pitt's government. Chapter 9. The Napoleonic Tunnels, a New Threat and a New Kind of Fortress, 1793 to 1815. The French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars brought Dover Castle into its most intensive period of development since the medieval sieges. By the late 1790s, Napoleon Bonaparte was preparing what he called the Army of England at Boulogne, 130,000 troops camped on the French coast, within sight of the English cliffs, awaiting the chance to cross the Channel and end Britain's resistance to French continental domination. Dover was once again the key to England. The military response was comprehensive. New fortifications, new guns, new earthworks on the western heights, and, most significantly, new tunnels. The Cromwell International account of the tunnel history gives the dates. The tunnels were first excavated between 1797 and 1802 to provide extra accommodation for troops stationed at Dover Castle. The original Napoleonic tunnels were cut through the chalk beneath the castle, creating a barracks for approximately 2,000 soldiers within the cliff itself. The chalk was workable, the underground position was bomb-proof, and the proximity to the main defensive installations made the tunnel barracks a practical solution to the overcrowding problem created by the massive troop concentrations at Dover during the invasion scare. The Napoleonic tunnels were not just barracks. They were also the beginning of the underground command and communications infrastructure that would reach its fullest development in 1940. The same logic that made the chalk useful as a barracks made it useful as a protected command center. Thick rock above, the cliff face ahead, communications with the port and the sea below. The combination of protection and observation that the tunnel position offered was the same combination that Ramsay would exploit in 1940 with the addition of 20th-century communications technology. The tunnels that were dug between 1797 and 1802 created a remarkable subterranean world beneath Castle Hill. Up to 2,000 soldiers could be quartered there, protected from artillery fire by the chalk above them, and connected to the castle's defenses by passages cut through the rock. The chalk was workable with the hand tools of the period, picks and shovels, and the skill of military engineers who had learned their trade in mining and fortification work across the Napoleonic Wars. Soldiers who had fought in the Low Countries, in Egypt, in Spain, could be quartered beneath a cliff in Kent, fed from kitchens cut from the rock, armed and ready within minutes to emerge onto the heights and defend the crossing. The tunnel barracks were not comfortable by any standard. The chalk was damp, the air was poor, the light was limited to what candles and lamps could provide. But they were functional, they were defensible, and they existed, which was more than could be said for any comparable facility in the southeast of England. The logic that had driven their construction, that Dover Castle was the primary defensive position against a French invasion, was the same logic that would drive their reactivation 140 years later against a German one. Napoleon never launched his invasion. The Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805 destroyed French and Spanish naval power and ended the threat of cross-channel invasion. The Army of England was never deployed as its creator intended. Napoleon turned it east, towards Austerlitz and the continental campaigns that would define the Napoleonic era. Dover's tunnels were dug in response to a threat that never materialized. They were left empty after Waterloo in 1815 ended the Napoleonic Wars, their potential unrecognized for another 130 years. The abandonment of the tunnels after Waterloo was a form of architectural time capsule, spaces cut and equipped for one emergency, preserved without significant change until the next emergency required them again. Victorian visitors occasionally explored them as curiosities, the chambers cut from the white chalk, the evidence of what Napoleonic military engineers had done in the rock. But the strategic significance that had produced them was, for over a century, absent. Chapter 10. The Wartime Tunnels, Operation Dynamo and the Miracle of Dunkirk, 1938 to 1945. In 1938, as war with Germany became increasingly likely, the abandoned Napoleonic tunnels under Dover Castle were modernized and converted to serve as the naval headquarters for Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, in command of naval operations in the Dover Strait. The Cromwell International account records the transformation. In 1938, these original tunnels were modernized to become in part the naval headquarters of Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay. Immediately before war broke out in 1939, Vice Admiral Ramsay had been in charge of converting the abandoned underground barracks into a naval headquarters with an operations room, offices, and living quarters. The tunnel complex grew. From the outbreak of war in 1939, the original Napoleonic tunnels were extended and eventually deepened by 2 additional levels. The Cromwell International account gives the tunnel hierarchy. The tunnels were extended, given alphabetical names as you go down: A, Annex; B, Bastion; C, Casemate; D, Dumpy, for Deep Underground Military Position Yellow; and E, Esplanade. Casemate level, where Ramsay's headquarters were located, gave the famous photograph of Ramsay standing on a balcony cut into the cliff face overlooking the channel, the same channel he was about to organize the biggest evacuation in history across. On 26 May 1940, Ramsay received the order to execute Operation Dynamo. The context was catastrophic. The German army's blitzkrieg through Belgium and France had outflanked and encircled the British Expeditionary Force and their French and Belgian allies. The BEF, the professional corps of the British Army, approximately 400,000 men, was retreating to the Channel coast. Their last defensible perimeter was Dunkirk. The port's infrastructure had been largely destroyed by German bombing. The beaches shelved so gently that large warships could not approach within a mile of the shore at low tide. The Luftwaffe was attacking continuously. Ramsay had planning data from May 19th, when it became clear that evacuation by sea would be necessary. The British Guild of Tourist Guides account describes his preparation. From May 19th, it became absolutely clear here in Britain that the BEF would have to be rescued, and that it would have to be done by sea. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, 1883 to 1945, who was called out of retirement at the beginning of the war, was in command of the Dover station and was planning the rescue operation together with his small team from Dover Castle. The three evacuation routes, X, Y, and Z, were Ramsay's tactical solution to the German naval and air threat. Route Z was the shortest, 39 miles. Route Y was the longest and safest from attack, 171 miles around the German-controlled coast. Ships' captains were free to choose their route based on conditions, speed, and the specific threats they faced. Ramsay coordinated the movement of hundreds of vessels simultaneously from his operations room in the casemate tunnels. The annex level of the tunnels, dug in 1941 to 42 specifically for the wartime hospital function, provided emergency surgical facilities and dormitories for medical staff. 2 operating theaters were cut from the chalk. The wounded from Dunkirk and from subsequent operations received immediate treatment in the tunnel hospital before transfer to inland hospitals. The tunnel complex had evolved from a barracks into a complete military headquarters, command center, communications exchange, hospital, dormitory, all protected by the white chalk of Castle Hill. On the 3rd of June 1940, Operation Dynamo was concluded. Ramsay and his team had evacuated 338,226 men from Dunkirk. The number was vastly more than the most optimistic pre-operation estimates had projected. The Admiralty had expected 45,000 at best. The little ships, the private vessels, fishing boats, pleasure cruisers, and ferries that crossed the channel alongside the warships had made the difference, able to approach the beaches that destroyers could not reach and ferry soldiers to the waiting warships. Churchill's "We shall fight on the beaches" speech acknowledged the disaster while proclaiming continued resistance. He said explicitly that wars are not won by evacuations. But the evacuation from Dunkirk was what made continued British resistance possible. The 338,000 men brought home by Ramsay's operation were the professional core of the British Army, and without them, Britain's capacity to fight on would have been catastrophically compromised. By keeping those men in the war, Operation Dynamo, planned and directed from tunnels under Dover Castle, was one of the decisive operations of the Second World War. Ramsay himself went on to play major roles in the subsequent phases of the war: the North Africa landings, the Sicily invasion, and, above all, the planning of D-Day, the Normandy landings of June 1944 that began the liberation of Europe. Operation Neptune, the naval component of D-Day, was his responsibility. The man who had organized the evacuation of 338,000 men from France in 1940 now organized the invasion of France in 1944. The same channel, the same logistics, reversed. He was knighted after Dunkirk, promoted to Admiral of the Fleet in 1944, and died in a plane crash in January 1945, 3 months before the end of the war in Europe. The plotting table from Ramsay's operations room at Dover was used after the war for training at HMS Dryad, the Royal Navy's maritime warfare school. It was later donated to English heritage by Ramsay's family and is now on display at Dover Castle, a physical continuity between the 1940 operations and the heritage institution that preserves their memory. The small details of the tunnel complex have similarly been preserved. The medical kit that belonged to a student who worked in the annex-level hospital, the communications equipment of the operations room, the photograph of Ramsay on the balcony of the casemate level, Looking out over the channel, he was about to organize the greatest evacuation in history across. The tunnel complex that Ramsay used was the direct descendant of the Napoleonic barracks dug 140 years earlier. The logic was identical: protected space within the chalk cliff, connecting the command position on Castle Hill to the harbor and the channel below. The technology was completely different: 20th century telephone exchanges, teleprinters, wireless communications. But the fundamental geography was the same as it had been for the Roman lighthouse keepers, for the Norman constable who blocked the northern gate after the 1216 siege, for Henry II's engineer Maurice, who had built the Great Tower to receive French pilgrims. The height above the channel, the view across to France, the control of the crossing, these things do not change. The dumpy level, dug below the wartime casemate level, represents the final phase of the tunnel complex's active military use. The name, Deep Underground Military Position Yellow, has the characteristically bureaucratic quality of Cold War military planning. The facility was equipped to allow the government of the southeast of England to continue functioning after a nuclear strike, with communications equipment, power generation, and the administrative capacity to manage a post-apocalyptic landscape. It has never been used. It stands as the most extreme expression of the same impulse that built the Iron Age hill fort: the belief that controlling this position above this crossing is worth whatever investment and whatever sacrifice it requires. Chapter 11: Cold War and Beyond: The Deepest Tunnels and What They Were For, 1945 to Present. The end of the Second World War did not end Dover Castle's secret function. The wartime tunnel complex, extended and deepened between 1938 and 1942, was maintained in military hands after 1945, while its potential post-war role was assessed. As the Cold War developed and nuclear war became a genuine strategic possibility, the deep tunnels under Dover Castle were given a new and darker purpose. The Cromwell International account of the Cold War use is precise. After the war, the tunnel complex remained in government service. The dumpy level was converted to serve as an emergency regional seat of government during the Cold War. The dumpy tunnel, Deep Underground Military Position Yellow, was the lowest level of the tunnel complex, cut deepest into the chalk and therefore most protected against the blast effects of nuclear weapons. It was equipped to serve as the administrative center, from which the government of the southeast of England would be conducted in the aftermath of a nuclear attack. This is the most recent chapter in a history that has run from Iron Age hill fort to Roman lighthouse to Saxon church to Norman castle to medieval siege to Tudor artillery platform to Napoleonic barracks to Second World War command center to Cold War government bunker. The same chalk cliff, the same strategic position above the channel crossing, the same fundamental logic. Control of this height means control of the crossing, and control of the crossing means the ability to project power over the most important sea passage in the northern world. Dover Castle today is managed by English Heritage and receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The Great Tower has been restored and reinterpreted to show what Henry II's palace looked like in the 1180s, with painted walls and furnished rooms that convey the sophistication of a 12th century royal court. The Secret Wartime Tunnels tour takes visitors through the casemate level with recreated operations rooms and projected footage. The Roman Pharos stands in its Saxon medieval combination, still the tallest Roman building in Britain. The castle's current complexity, the layers of construction and repurposing that represent every major phase of British history, is its most historically interesting quality. There is nowhere else in England where you can stand within a few meters of a Roman lighthouse, a Saxon church, a Norman keep, and a Cold War government bunker. The site is a vertical cross-section through British history, each layer the consequence of the same underlying fact. This specific position above this specific sea crossing has been too important to leave undefended for 2,000 years. The Dumpy Tunnel, prepared as a regional seat of government for a nuclear war that never happened, is in some ways the most philosophically interesting space in the castle. Every other function Dover has performed across 2,000 years has been about controlling something: the channel crossing, the movement of armies, the communication of information. The dumpy function was about surviving the end of the world and governing whatever might remain of southeast England afterward. It is the most extreme expression of the same logic that produced the Iron Age hill fort. Control of this position is control of this region, whatever catastrophe may come. The Cold War use of the tunnels was classified secret for decades. The wartime Dunkirk operations were publicly celebrated. The nuclear government bunker was not publicly acknowledged. When the Cold War ended and the dumpy function was decommissioned, the space became accessible to researchers and eventually to visitors. The most recent layer of Dover's 2,000-year history of secret military operations was, in the end, revealed like the others, not by conquest or catastrophe, but by the end of the threat that had required it. Dover Castle today receives more visitors than at any point in its history. The Channel Tunnel, which opened in 1994 just a few miles along the coast, provides a crossing that requires no management of the heights above the harbor. The strategic logic that produced the Iron Age hill fort, the Roman Pharos, the Norman Castle, the Tudor artillery platforms, the Napoleonic barracks, and the Second World War operations room is, for the first time in 2,000 years, no longer operative in quite the same way. The castle now manages not armies and navies, but visitor flows and heritage narratives. And yet, the view from the top of the castle has not changed. The channel below, the French coast visible on clear days, the same crossing that every ruler of England has needed to control. The Pharos still stands. The geometry is unchanged. Chapter 12. What Dover actually means. 2,000 years of the same strategic logic. The myth of Dover Castle is the silhouette. The towers on the white cliffs, the dramatic channel backdrop, the guardian of the channel formulation that appears in every tourist brochure. This is accurate. Dover has been the guardian of the channel crossing for as long as anyone has guarded anything in Britain. What the brochure doesn't fully convey is the specific quality of each moment in that guardianship. The particular human decisions, the contingent accidents of history, the occasions on which the castle's existence, or its defense, or its contents, made the difference between one kind of history and another. Henry II built his great tower not to defend England, but to receive French pilgrims visiting Becket's shrine, because the murder of his own archbishop had, accidentally, turned Canterbury into the most important pilgrimage site in northern Europe. The castle's greatest architectural achievement was the direct consequence of a political murder and a king's embarrassment at being unable to properly accommodate a visiting French monarch. He spent what amounted to a quarter of his annual income on a single castle for reasons that had almost nothing to do with military strategy. Hubert de Burgh held the castle for 9-year-old Henry III against the full force of the French army and the rebel English barons, at the moment when England came closest in any century to becoming a permanent French possession. His refusal to surrender the key to England, a phrase he coined specifically about Dover, is one of the most consequential individual acts of obstinacy in British history. If de Burgh had surrendered when Louis urged him to, after John's death, the England that eventually evolved into the constitutional monarchy we recognize today might never have existed. Bertram Ramsay planned Operation Dynamo in a tunnel that had originally been dug as a barracks for soldiers preparing to resist Napoleon. The Napoleonic invasion never came, but the tunnel was there, and it was the tunnel that provided Ramsay with the protected command position from which he evacuated 338,000 men and kept Britain in the war. The same strategic position that had been exploited by every previous guardian of the Channel, the height above the crossing, the view to France, the proximity to the harbor, was exploited again in 1940 by a man in a chalk tunnel with a telephone exchange. The dumpy tunnel, deepest and most protected, was equipped for a nuclear apocalypse that, mercifully, never happened. It has never been used for the purpose for which it was built. The castle that has been used for every other purpose for which it has been built has, in this final function, been preserved from use by the thing it was built against. The Roman Pharos still stands. It was built to light the way for Roman ships crossing the Channel in the 1st century A.D. It is one of only 3 Roman lighthouses to survive anywhere in the former Roman Empire. It has been standing on Castle Hill for 19 centuries, through the Saxon church that incorporated it, through the Norman castle that surrounded it, through the medieval sieges and the Tudor artillery and the Napoleonic barracks and the Second World War operations room. It has been there longer than England. Every commanding officer of Dover Castle has understood the same thing. The cross-channel position cannot be undefended. The specific form of the defense has changed with each era: hill fort, lighthouse, Norman keep, concentric castle, artillery platform, tunnel network, but the underlying logic has not. 2,000 years of strategic continuity in a single site is, in the history of fortification, genuinely extraordinary. And in the white chalk of Castle Hill, cut by Roman engineers, medieval miners, Napoleonic sappers, and 20th century military construction teams, that logic is written in stone.